so many Iraqi children under the UN sanctions, which of course are principally still supported by the United States. Whether or not he really felt that strongly, that is what he said. Have a special resonance in an Arab world which has for decades felt humiliated by the West, especially by America, a world which many of its millions believe has indeed been corrupted and damaged almost beyond repair by the culture and armed might and politics of the West. Without those feelings of despair and humiliation and fury, bin Laden would truly be a voice in the wilderness, ignored, derided, perhaps freighted to a hospital for the insane. But to many Arabs, and this is the point, to many Arabs who were appalled for both moral and religious reasons by the staggering massacres in New York and Washington, bin Laden does not sound insane, which is why his voice carries so much powerful resonance to tens of millions of people, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent now 27 years in the Middle East trying to answer the whys. And in no part of the world is our reporting so flawed, so biased in favour of one country, Israel, and so consensual in its use of words. Indeed, the language of Middle East journalism has become so cowardly, so slippery, so deferential, so locked into the phrases used by the State Department, the President, US diplomats, Israeli officials, that our reporting has in many cases become incomprehensible. Such is the bizarre nature of our profession in the region that any talk like the one I'm giving you tonight has to have a kind of mantra, a protective mantra. So here we go. Yes, Saddam Hussein is a wicked, cruel tyrant who invaded Iran, when he was on our side, of course, and Kuwait. Yes, he did use poison gas on the Kurds. The governments of the West did nothing at the time, but that's something else. His Iranian war cost up to 1 million lives. He does have a hangman on 24-hour duty at Abu Ghraib prison. Women are hanged on Tuesdays, and if there's an overflow, on Thursdays too. Yasser Arafat is a corrupt, vain little despot, allowing his 11, some say 13 secret services, when they can operate, to beat, torture and occasionally kill Palestinian opponents. I should add that I never could see why Israel wanted to negotiate with him, unless they saw him as a weak militia ally who could police the West Bank and Gaza on their behalf, which I think indeed is the truth. It's interesting that after the Gulf War in 1991, all the journalists I know predicted the downfall of the two men who had shown sympathy, or more than sympathy, for Saddam Hussein, Yasser Arafat and King Hussein of Jordan. And yet these were the two Arab leaders who in the coming years would make peace with Israel. I think what happened is that they were then weak enough for Israel to make peace with. So if you don't support Saddam, watch out. Well, I think the real point, however, is that in the Middle East, many of our journalists are distorting the truth, either because we are afraid of criticisms from Israel and its supporters, or because we journalists prefer an easy life, unencumbered by hate mail and letters to the editor. Let's take the pejorative use of the word terrorist. Now, the mass murders of September the 11th may require a redefinition by those journalists, including myself, who normally abjure the word in Middle East reporting on the grounds that it is used exclusively about Arabs. But its overuse, almost as a punctuation mark in any discussion of the Arab-Israeli dispute, remains as poisonous as ever. It's difficult to explain to Arabs, for example, why the New York and Washington massacres were an act of terrorism, which it was, but why the massacre of up to 1,700 Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps of Beirut between the 16th and 18th of September 1982 has never been called an act of terrorism by journalists or by governments. The death toll in Shatila, remember, was more than half that of the Twin Towers on September 11th. But we didn't call the killers terrorists. Was this strange omission of the word terrorism because the killers, members of the Christian Phalangist militia, happened to be allied to Israel? Did it not qualify as an act of terrorism because most of the murderers were wearing Israeli Defense Force uniforms, albeit with the acronym Sahal in Hebrew painted out? Or did it fail to meet the terrorism test because Israeli forces had surrounded the camp in 1982 and because Ariel Sharon, then of course Israel's defense minister, had sent the Phalange into the camps? Not once, ever, has a Western newspaper called the mass murderers of Sabra and Shatila terrorists. Indeed, Israel's own Kahan Commission of Inquiry into the massacre not a bad document, though flawed in some ways, a document which held Ariel Sharon personally responsible for the killings, called the killers soldiers. This is not an isolated example. When an Israeli reserve officer, Baruch Goldstein, massacred 29 Palestinians in a Hebron mosque, 25th of February 1994, he was not called a terrorist. CNN referred to him as deranged. Later, the Israeli ambassador in London, this is my favourite one, said that Goldstein was, quote, deranged by fanaticism. Psychologists among you can explain that to me afterwards. Other reports spoke of Goldstein as extremist and as a member of a Jewish underground group. See, underground has this resonance from the Second World War, the Polish underground, the French underground, something rather noble. Yet when Hamas took its inevitable and wicked revenge with a bus bomb in the Israeli town of Afula, CNN recovered its nerve. Reporter Bill Delaney told us it was an act of no Arab terrorism. You've got to get the two together. The end of the lecture, we'll do it again. Of far greater ethical significance was the cover of Newsweek magazine, which I've got ready for you down here. Yep, I have. Now, let's have a look. Can we put the lights down, Tom, just for a little bit there? I love Newsweek's front covers. Now, as you see, terror goes global, alluding to Osama bin Laden's international network of terror. Pretty accurate. This is February 19, 2001. They got that right. Okay. Beneath these words, however, as you can see, is a photograph of a Palestinian. He's wearing a kufiya, holding in his hands an automatic rifle, I think an M16. Now, readers might suppose, you might suppose, might you not, that this is part of the terror network. Indeed, you're obviously meant to believe this. But I was puzzled about this cover picture. I'd seen it before, you see. It was taken by Ilka Yumanen of the Gamma Picture Agency in Paris. Yumanen lives now in New York, so I called him up from Beirut, and he confirmed the cover picture was his. I took the picture in the West Bank, he told me. It was a member of Tanzim, the Palestinian militia, at a Palestinian funeral. Thus, you see, a Palestinian gunman, armed and attending the funeral of a fellow Palestinian killed by Israelis, had been turned into a representative of global terror. That's what it says. Palestinians as a people, and the man on Newsweek's cover is very definitely a Palestinian, have been effortlessly transformed into enemies of the world. Just what Mr. Sharon wants. It wasn't the fault of the photographer that Newsweek's cover picture was a lie. The man whose face was covered by the kufiya, dangerous though he would be to the Israelis, has nothing to do with bin Laden or the lead story in the magazine. Now, just as Ariel Sharon, Israel's Prime Minister today, of course, has been doing his best to link Yasser Arafat with bin Laden, journalists have gone out of their way to decontextualize Israel's role in the occupied territories. Indeed, once the State Department told its diplomats, it was actually a direct personal memo from Colin Powell, I thought of that today when I was looking at him, once they got the message that they were to stop using the word occupied in relation to the West Bank and Gaza, American journalists, many of them, followed this example. Henceforth, the land would be called disputed. As in, Benjamin Netanyahu, this is Time magazine, Benjamin Netanyahu turns up the heat by okaying new houses in disputed territory. Disputed, of course, changes the reality. By deleting occupation from their lexicon, journalists erase the colonies illegally built for Jews and Jews only on Arab land. They erase the many Israeli checkpoints which still covered, as they do today, the West Bank and Gaza. You know, I was on a live radio interview in Beirut the other day, the perils of the mobile phone. I was in Ashrafia, driving along, phone goes, BBC World Service, direct lines through to an Israeli spokesman. We're going to have a discussion about events in the West Bank. And the moment I referred to the occupied territories, the voice in Jerusalem, they are not occupied. So I said, I see. So you mean the soldiers who stopped my car last week between Ramallah and Jenin, they were Swiss, were they? Or maybe they were Burmese. You see, disputed suggests an argument about land deeds, or conflicting heritage claims, as CNN once memorably called them, failing to point out that Palestinians, many of them, have documents to prove land ownership, while many Israeli settlers believe that the man up there gave the land to them without a document, or with a very important document, but not one that goes through lawyers. there's a problem there, isn't there? The Associated Press, largest news agency in America, second largest in the world after Reuters, has now referred and constantly refers to the occupied lands not as occupied but as, quote, war won. You will never find the word occupied in AP now. War won. Funny old word, isn't it? Very difficult contortion, sort of war won, war won. There must be something very frightening to avoid, to use a silly phrase like that. The contorted expression, of course, places an almost victorious facade upon the illegality of occupation. I've been searching in vain to find the first use of the phrase settlements and settlers in relation to Israel's occupation. You see, the Israeli settlements are occupied. They're on occupied land, and they're occupied as colonies, and their inhabitants are colonists every bit as much as the French colonized Algeria. When I made this point in my own newspaper, the London Independent, a stream of letters accused me of deliberately trying to make a parallel between Palestinian terrorism and the FLN's ultimately successful 1954-62 war of independence against France. I was indeed making that parallel. Interestingly, Sharon has himself compared all of Israel to Algeria under French rule. Weren't shown this in a newspaper here, were you? It was revealed in a very important interview in the French magazine L'Express in the Christmas of 2001, when he said that he told President Chirac of France that, quote, this is Sharon speaking, "You've got to understand that we here, we are like you in Algeria. We have no other place to go, and besides, we have no intention of leaving." The French word for a settler is colon, accurately representing what the Israeli settlers in the West Bank and Gaza are doing, colonizing. But today, even that tame word settlement is disappearing in British and American journalism. CNN, in one of its most recent contributions to journalism, sent out an instruction to correspondents telling them that Gilo, the Jewish settlement built largely on Arab land south of Jerusalem, is to change its definition. I have the CNN memo, and I will now quote it to you. Quote, "We refer to Gilo as a Jewish neighborhood on the outskirts of Jerusalem, but on land occupied by Israel, built on land occupied by Israel in 1967, we don't refer to it as a settlement." Now it happens that Gilo is a settlement or colony built for Jews only on occupied and largely Palestinian land. CNN at least got the occupied bit right. It's partly owned by Palestinians in the neighboring Christian village of Beit Jala. Gilo is Hebrew for Jala. It was constructed in violation of UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338, and we have to remember, don't we, that we have to obey UN resolutions, and it was against international law. It has also been incorporated into the enlarged municipality of Jerusalem, in itself partly an illegal annexation. But CNN's little lie about neighbourhood again transforms the reality. You see, neighbourhood, like some small suburb of Boston, is a cosy, friendly neighbourhood. Why on earth would anyone attack a neighbourhood? To fire guns in a neighbourhood is obviously the act of madmen, mindless terrorists, evil men. There can't be a reason. You see, as the viewer is spared the ultimate reality of the settlement, so Palestinian violence, however reprehensible, becomes inexplicable. No need for the whys. Of course, I asked for a comment from CNN, called up Atlanta from Beirut, and in fairness to CNN, I must give you their reply. The spokesman said, quote, "We really don't want to talk about this." And I can well see why. The BBC has also recently advised its reporters in the Middle East, another little instruction of which I have a copy, to use the phrase, quote, "targeted killings," unquote, for the murder of Palestinians by Israeli death squads, preferring this to assassinations which, so thinks the BBC, might be reserved for more important folk than the suspected Palestinian gunmen and bombers on Israel's hit list. But it just happens, doesn't it? It just happens that targeted killings, quote, is Israel's own expression for its killing of selected Palestinians, and I don't believe the BBC was unaware of this. As the growing list of totally innocent civilians killed during these attacks demonstrates, and do not forget the growing list of Israeli civilians killed in wicked suicide bombings, but we're talking here about the Palestinians, those targeted killings do include women and children. The word targeted is therefore highly misleading. I was amused to see a BBC advertisement for a television documentary about the end of the peace process. A bit more exclusion of linguistic narrative here. If we could just have the lights down, Tom, just briefly here. Here's the programme. It's called When Peace Died. On the left, of course, you'll recognise the photograph of the Palestinian, appalling photograph, with